Hello, Tom. You can sit down, thank you. Great. You can be a contributor to the conversation that we're about to have. Excellent. Hopefully we'll get some more people in the room. All right. I'd like to welcome you to our session afternoon, Clean Industries, Manufacturing and Exports. My name is Monica Richter. I work in the Climate and Energy Practice in WWF Australia. I'd like to acknowledge that we are all on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present and any Indigenous people who are here today. I was really sort of thinking about yesterday's day and how we started. I think it's Christian Hampton, and he's an Indigenous designer, and he talked about this connection between climate and nature and the journey that we are all on to look after. And so he sort of, within his comments, he said, "How do we be good ancestors?" And I think that's such a really important thing for us to be thinking about as we do this work. Yesterday we had a session on just transitions in this clean economy space. We had some, panel conversations this morning as well, and the just transitions piece. I mean, these are large industrial complexes. They are going to be doing some clearing of land. They will be having some impact on the environment, but how do we try and do this in a way that minimises the footprint? How do we do this in a way that provides not just conversations with communities and First Nations people as stakeholders, but how do we actually allow them to be shareholders in the conversation that we are engaging in these industrial processes? What kind of community benefits can we really bring to communities so they feel included? We talked about, not just the technological solutions, which of course are really important, but what are the social models and the market models that enable us to create and bring people on the journey for this? We're not starting from ground zero. People have gone through complex changes. The Australian economy has gone through complex changes. We heard from the Assistant Minister for Climate Change this morning, Josh Wilson, about the different kinds of commodities that we've exported over the last 150 years, and that by 2050 the different kind of commodities that we'll be exporting. But in a decarbonised economy they can be different. We can use our imagination to transform our economy. And so, part of this conversation is how do we transform from being fossil fuel exporters to being mining and making exporters, and to really fit into our comparative advantage in clever ways. And how do we bring our trading partners along on this journey? So, for example, Japan, Korea, China, our major trading partners. We currently export gas, iron ore, coal, both thermal and metallurgical coal, to them. How do we bring them on the journey as they work through their decarbonisation pathways as well? So last month, WWF released a report. Australia is a green iron key. I don't have any more reports or summaries. I've given them out to people in the audience already. If you want to have a copy, find me on LinkedIn, find it on our website, and it sort of spells out what WWF's vision is around how do we actually help to create and enable a green iron manufacturing industry in Australia, and how do we do it well, and how do we bring our trading partners along with us. So in the context of this opportunity that we have here in Australia, I'm really delighted that we are going to have this time together. We've got about 90 minutes and we've got fantastic speakers. So we've got some PowerPoint presentations as well, so you get a bit of a chance. And I guess today we're going to do a bit more of a deep dive into some of the details on what this is going to look like for the clean export sector. So I'm going to bring the speakers up. We're going to sit there, and then we'll have our presentations, and then there's a chance for a bit of a panel conversation and some Q&A. So first up, Professor Elizabeth Thurbon, please come up. I'm Deputy Head of School, Professor of International Political Economy at the University of New South Wales. I'm Baethan Mullen, I'm CEO of the Superpower Institute. We've got Dr. Jorrit Gosens, Senior Lecturer, Centre for Climate and Energy Policy, Crawford School of Public Policy at the ANU. And we have Warren Flentje, Industrial Decarbonisation Lead towards Net Zero Emission at CSIRO, and Associate Professor Emma Aisbett, School of Law, Associate Director Research, Zero Carbon Energy for the Asia Pacific Grand Challenge. Wonderful. So we're going to start with you, Liz, on the role of statecraft. It's a term that I guess the NGO sector is starting to become more familiar with, green energy statecraft. What does it mean? Why is this issue really important? How do we use statecraft in a way that engages the diplomatic community beyond just thinking about this as industrial transformation? So I'll pass this over to you. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Great. Oh, and for the slides, just this forward, I guess. Excellent. Thank you so much, Monica, for that lovely introduction and for all the work, of course, that you do to draw our attention to the enormous opportunities facing Australia in the green energy shift. And I think that when it does come to the energy transition, if there's one thing that Australia is pretty clearly not short on, it is opportunity. So here is the question. What are we short on? What do we lack that might stop us from seizing these incredible opportunities, these manufacturing, these export opportunities, and maximising their multiple benefits to the nation? So their economic security benefits, their energy security benefits, their environmental security benefits, and also their geostrategic security benefits, which we might talk about a little bit later on. Well, we certainly don't lack policy ideas. Thanks to the incredible efforts of a large number of outstanding Australian think tanks and policy entrepreneurs, there are lots of really great policy proposals out there in the public domain, and indeed some great policies are now working their way through government at state and federal levels, although there is always more that could be done. And we certainly don't lack ideas for institutional reform. Here again, we've had lots of great proposals and seen some good action since 2023, from the creation of the NRF to the Net Zero Economic Agency as a kind of coordinating agency. Again, always more that can be done, but we are on the way in institutional terms. And in light of the recent passing of FEMA through the lower house, I think it's fair to say that we no longer lack the political will and ambition, at least within key segments of the government. The Albanese government has pledged what, in Australian terms is really quite massive amounts of money to turbocharging Australia's green industry building efforts under the Future Made in Australia Act. Again, always more that could be done, but a really solid start. So what are we lacking? Or to put it another way, what are the most likely obstacles to us sustaining and successfully executing this ambitious green energy transformation agenda? Well, I come to this question as a political scientist, and a political scientist with an expertise in questions of the state and the strategic role of the state in techno-industrial transformation. I've spent the last 20 years or so researching the highly ambitious and very effective techno-industrial transformation strategies of our Northeast Asian neighbours, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan and China. And I've spent the last 10 years or so researching the strategic ways in which East Asian states have been building and scaling the new green energy industries of the future, from green hydrogen to EVs, to smart grids and related technologies and beyond. And these research efforts, there we go, have recently come to fruition in a new book with my excellent collaborators, John Matthews, Sun Young Kim, Hao Tan. And this isn't a sales pitch because this book is free. You can download it for free from the Oxford University Press website. And more recently, I've been working on a suite of shorter conceptual and policy pieces with my good collaborators, Alexander Hind and Hao Tan. And drawing on these insights today, I want to focus on what I see as kind of two key obstacles to Australian success and one potential solution, which I offer modestly. The first obstacle really is this lack of consensus among the Australian political and policy elite about whether the state, whether the government should actually be assuming such an ambitious and active role in driving and shaping the green energy shift. The Albanese government is clearly willing to embrace a more expansive, a more strategic role for the government. But there are many powerful policy and political players who still really fundamentally object to this idea, including influential segments of the bureaucracy, influential elected officials, especially from members of the coalition, and influential voices within academic and media circles. You only need to open the opinion pages of The Australian or the Oz Financial Review to read opinions of kind of more mainstream economists to know this to be true. And so this lack of consensus about really the appropriate role of the government in the green energy shift is a really big problem, because without a consensus, it's very likely that the gains that we make under this government will be reversed with the election of a coalition, as they have been in the past. Now, I don't think that that's a particularly controversial point, but this following point might be a little bit more controversial, so bear with me. I think that the second thing holding us back beyond this lack of political consensus is the way in which those of us advocating for a more ambitious and strategic role for the government have been trying to prosecute the case and win over detractors. And that is by using this language of industry policy or green industry policy. In recent years, the call for industry policy or green industry policy has been embraced by politicians, by sympathetic bureaucrats, by industry groups, by unions, think tanks, and by well-meaning international influencers like Mariana Mazzucato, who are all united in the call for Australia to re-embrace industry policy, because we did this in the 1980s and 1990s, to expedite the green energy shift. But if I could be very blunt, industry policy is the wrong language, and I think it's really unhelpful language for two main reasons. First of all, I think that in Australia, perhaps more than in any other country, industry policy is a highly divisive and politicised term. In fact, since the 80s, industry policy has been one of the most misused and abused terms in our nation's political discourse. Even just to say it often is enough to make people kind of like, they yawn, their eyes glaze over, they just switch off. You just can't have this conversation. So it's become a real kind of conversation stopper and a kind of thought blocker. And this makes it really impossible to have a sensible national debate about what effective strategic techno-industrial governance actually looks like. So you end up just basically shouting into the wind and having arguments that you don't really want or need to have. So for this reason, it will never really be a language that can be used to bridge the political divide and to unify political and policy leaders behind a more ambitious and strategic approach. But there's a second and even more compelling reason why we should stop using the term industry policy when advocating for a more strategic role for the state. And that is because it doesn't actually describe the governance approach that is being embraced by our most important energy and economic partners and rivals, including Korea, Japan, China, and the US. And it doesn't capture the kind of governance response required from Australia. And as I've argued at length with my collaborators, the governments of East Asia aren't engaged in industry policy. They're engaged in a very sophisticated new kind of economic statecraft, or what we call green energy statecraft. So what is this? And how does it differ from industry policy? Well, basically, green energy statecraft is the practice of mobilising energy-related policies and institutions to address national security challenges. So what does it actually look like and involve? Well, here is a visual, and it's kind of adapted as an ideal type from our empirical observations of the East Asian experience. So at the highest level, the practice of green energy statecraft is both motivated and sustained by a particular mindset or way of thinking about the green energy shift that unites the policy community. Policymakers who practice green energy statecraft, like those in East Asia, believe that the economy can and should serve a higher purpose, that of the purpose of delivering national security and prosperity broadly defined. So more specifically, policymakers who practice green energy statecraft believe that advanced technological and manufacturing capabilities hold the key to national security, because when you possess those advanced technological and manufacturing capabilities, you can manufacture your own energy security. You can manufacture your nation's economic security. You can manufacture your nation's environmental security, and you can manufacture your nation's military security. So governments that practice this green energy statecraft, like our Northeast Asian neighbours, are seeking to solve these interrelated national security challenges in one hit by promoting a rapid green energy shift. So that's the kind of mindset that underpins green energy statecraft. And you can see here that green energy statecraft captures a much more expansive and integrated approach to governing the green transition. It's an approach that places equal emphasis on domestically oriented and externally oriented aspects of the green transition. And so when it comes to the domestically oriented aspects, this is focused on squarely on building the new green energy industries of the future to fend off or outflank or to move in step with foreign rivals. So with the national security motivations at play, governments that practice this kind of statecraft create bold new visions for industries like green hydrogen and green steel and bioenergy. They set clear production and export and, most importantly, technology upgrading targets. They also mobilise all available financial resources and policy instruments to ensure that those targets are met. And they're not afraid of disciplining recipients of government support, for example, by making that support dependent on the attainment of performance targets. And I know I am out of time. I'll be very quick. I'm wrapping up. And so in all these ways, green energy statecraft is really different from plain old industry policy. Industry policy is this really generic term that can be used to describe any policy that's intended to shape the economy by targeting particular firms or industries, regardless of the policymaker's motivation. So it could have little or nothing to do with responding to national security challenges or building globally competitive industries. It could just be about pork barrelling or job creation or regional development or else. So for this reason, given the different motivations at play, industry policies are often less ambitious, they're less targeted, they're less conditional on outcomes, and they pay far less attention to international competitiveness concerns. So really, the take-home message that I have is that there are multiple benefits to embracing both the language and the mindset and the practice of energy statecraft in Australia. First, it's a language that's likely to appeal across the political spectrum, including the conservative side of politics, insofar as it really foregrounds the pressing national security imperatives that underpin the transition. Secondly, it more accurately describes what is going on in the world and the kind of response that's required of Australia if we want to meet these global competitive challenges. Third, the language of statecraft has the potential, I think, to lift the gaze and to focus the mind and to raise the ambition of Australian policymakers engaged in economic and energy governance, drawing attention to the strategic national significance of the activities that they are engaged in. It draws our attention to the fact that our domestic green industry building initiatives are not the exclusive responsibility of the industry minister or the energy minister. They're the responsibility of the whole of government, and it has to be led and coordinated from the highest levels. It draws our attention to the fact that the success of our domestic industry building initiatives will hinge to a very large degree on our externally oriented statecraft efforts, our ability to engage deeply and to forge productive partnerships with our economic and energy and military security partners and allies like Japan and Korea, on our ability to understand the security needs of our partners and how our green industry building initiatives might help them meet those security needs, our ability to leverage our partners' dependence on us to ensure that future foreign investments in Australia actually have real national benefit, that they're transformative, not extractive. There's a lot more I could say, but I'm totally out of time, more than out of time. So language matters. If we want policymakers to act, and if we want our calls for strategic activism to unite, not divide, we need to choose our words very carefully. And I think that those words have something to do with green energy statecraft. Thanks.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That was very insightful, and I think it sort of helps to frame and shape the conversation that we're going to have furthermore. So now we're going to go to Baethan Mullen, please.
How about now? Excellent. Thanks, Monica. And that was excellent, Liz. A great start to this panel, I think. And after hearing the discussions this morning, I have to say I'm really pleased that the superpower opportunity is a hot topic. It's obviously what my organisation's all about. And I think it's pretty clear to me that the case for embracing the opportunity has already been well made, so I'm not going to cover that ground again. And I don't think I need to spend the next 5 minutes here with that sales pitch. So I'm going to pivot a little bit and play the villain and describe why this opportunity won't be realised without significant changes in policy and investments and in diplomacy, as Liz has covered well. So Australia is poised to take advantage of the incredible economic and decarbonisation opportunity that the superpower green exports industries present. And the logic of it seems irresistible. So what's missing? The reality is that there is still huge economic, policy and practical barriers to achieving the superpower vision for Australia, and technical barriers as well, as I'm sure my colleagues on my right here are going to talk about. My organisation, the Superpower Institute, was founded by economists Rod Sims and Ross Garnaut to help overcome these barriers. We're dedicated to helping Australia leverage its comparative advantages to become a global leader in a post-carbon economy. Our work focuses on practical research and policy development aimed at unlocking the potential of renewable energy and green exports. And by doing so, we aim to ensure that Australia can lead in this new economic era. But despite some progress, several challenges need to be addressed if we're to realise the opportunity. Firstly, to give some sense of the scale of the mountain to climb, consider the amount of renewable energy that needs to be built to underpin the superpower opportunity. You're probably familiar with the planned 32 gigawatts of construction of renewables and storage under the Capacity Investment Scheme. This is obviously welcome and critical. However, just to produce 10 million tonnes of green iron, we estimate that the renewable energy requirement would be in the order of 17 gigawatts. Now, if you scale that up to a full-sized industry across the superpower spectrum, the amount of energy required is eye-watering. Then there's a number of market failures. First, there's the failure, at least in this country, to price carbon emissions through a stable and predictable policy mechanism, such as a carbon tax or emissions trading scheme. Without carbon prices globally, but particularly with Australia's major trading partners, industries that produce carbon-intensive products will continue to dominate. Steel and aluminium production using fossil fuels accounts for more than 10% of global carbon emissions. The absence of a carbon price means the costs of these emissions are not factored into the prices of those products, distorting the market and making it impossible for green manufacturing processes to compete on equal terms. Innovation and the risk for early movers is another challenge. Early movers in the green economy often bear large capital costs and risks, generating knowledge that benefits others without adequate compensation. This reduces the incentive to invest in new technologies, which is crucial for developing green industries. Then there's infrastructure, also a critical concern. The regions with the greatest potential for green metals production often lack the necessary infrastructure, such as electricity transmission lines, storage and transport facilities. It's not economically viable for a single private entity to provide these at the required scale, making government intervention or consortia approaches necessary to build the infrastructure that will enable green industries to develop. Lastly, and as Liz covered really well, international competition and trade policies present challenges. Our trade partners and competitors are also moving toward decarbonisation, and Australia must ensure that it is a credible supplier of green products that meet the stringent requirements of green trade schemes such as the EU's carbon border adjustment mechanism. So, what are the solutions? To overcome these challenges, a comprehensive policy response is required, and the Superpower Institute advocates for a policy approach based on 4 key pillars. First, pricing the negative externality. Introducing a carbon price or equivalent mechanism, such as a carbon solutions levy, is essential. This would ensure that the social costs of carbon emissions are reflected in the prices of goods, creating a level playing field for green industries. Secondly, subsidising the positive externalities. To address the innovation market failure, we propose substantial grants or tax credits for early movers in the green economy. These should focus on reducing the upfront capital costs of pioneering projects, helping to mitigate risks and encourage innovation. Third, government provision of infrastructure. The government should take a leading role in funding the necessary infrastructure for green industries, particularly in regions with high potential. This includes building transmission lines, hydrogen storage and transport facilities ahead of demand, ensuring that infrastructure is not a barrier to private investment. And finally, active international diplomacy. Australia must engage proactively with its trade partners to ensure green premiums for its exports and to ensure that Australian products meet international green standards. The diplomatic effort is crucial to making Australian green metals competitive in the global market. So our role is to continue to push for these policy settings and measures that will underpin the superpower opportunity for Australia. And I guess to sum up, Australia is well positioned to lead the global transition to a green economy. However, realising the potential requires addressing the market failures and challenges that currently inhibit investment and innovation in green industries. With the right policies and a commitment to a long-term vision, Australia can become a renewable energy and green export superpower, contributing both to national prosperity and global efforts to mitigate climate change. Thank you.
Challenges that we have, as well as some of those solutions that are needed. So now we're going to hear from Jorrit. You're going to do a bit of a deep dive into where some of our trading partners are at, in particular, your specialty being China. But we're really welcome to hear from you in a bit more detail as well on some of those markets that you've been specialising in. Thank you.
Good, thanks for that. So a couple of slides. I like to work with some visuals. So my name is Jorrit Gosens. I work at the ANU on green steel making and the modeling of it and some policy and market review. The thinking is that we can decarbonize the steelmaking industry in the APAC really by what we would call reorganizing the value chains. And I'll explain what that means. But first, sort of to point out, the current value chains in green steel making are shipping of iron ore. So you basically start with iron ore, you turn that into iron and then into steel. Iron is really only consumed locally, and steel is very largely consumed locally. So international trading in those value chains is entirely in the iron ore step right now, pretty much. And if you look at that, Australia is a very large producer of iron ore, and we basically supply roughly 60% of all the key major markets in the APAC. So China, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Vietnam, and Indonesia. Of course, what stands out here is that China really is the big bar there. India has a lot of iron ore itself, so it doesn't really need our iron ore. That might change in the future though. But value chains for iron ore in the APAC is mostly a Chinese story, is what I'm trying to explain. Then the reorganization of those value chains. So again, what we do now mostly is ship iron ore to other countries where it's turned into iron and then into steel. And the hope very much is that with our renewable energy resources here, we could turn that iron ore into iron and ship that to our customers, or alternatively even turn that all the way into steel and then sell it to our customers. So downstream, developing downstream activities really. Why would we do that? And what are the things that stand in the way of that happening? So first is the renewable energy resource endowment. And here what you can see on a map is that basically is the solar radiation intensity. And of course, what stands out is that we have excellent solar resources. That's one good step of the way to producing cheap renewable electricity, not the only thing. Construction costs, labor costs factor in as well, and that not necessarily that would mean we can produce hydrogen very cheaply, which we will need to produce green iron. But what stands out is that our solar resources are a lot better than elsewhere in the region, and certainly also in Korea and Taiwan. They are quite poor in how well they're able to generate their renewable electricity. So for those countries, if they think about transitioning their entire economy to renewable energy resources, they're quite limited in what they can generate domestically, and so they try to import renewable energy effectively by importing green iron or green steel. Then that's a part of your economy that you don't need to decarbonize domestically already. For Japan and especially China, that might be a bit of a different equation because they're a bit more sensitive on outsourcing these quite important industries wholesale to other countries. However, if we then look at sort of the value of different steps in this value chain, so now just focusing on basically the iron and steel making steps, what I've done here is I've plotted so the emissions for individual steps as well as the labor and the investment, so basically the environmental and the economic impacts of these production steps. And what you can see, so the orange or brownish parts is the agglomeration step. So that's basically some pre-processing of the ore. The gray and black part is the iron making step, and the blue and red bars are the steel making step. What is very obvious is that a gigantic portion of your emissions is going to come from the iron making step, whereas a very large portion of the economic activity is actually located in the steel and downstream activities based on steel. So that's turning the steel into steel products. That's all much more economically important. So for a country like China that doesn't like to offshore these kind of economically important industries, they could still say, maybe there's a middle way. Maybe we could export or outsource the iron making step, which is where all the emissions are, but not much of the economical benefits. That's an argument that we can make. The Chinese have not yet completely figured that out, but we could help them make that realization. Another thing that matters is your current capacity for steelmaking, really. And what I've plotted here is the age of steelmaking plants in the OECD, so advanced economies and China here, separated by blast furnace capacity, so that's basically coal-based steelmaking, and electric arc furnace capacity, which is usually used for recycling scrap. Very low emissions, about 10% of the blast furnace steelmaking. And the EAF is also considered one of the key routes to green steel making, so from high-grade iron ores. And quite obviously, the OECD countries have been building that sort of green or green-ready kind of steelmaking infrastructure for very long already. In China, we see quite the opposite. They have a large fleet of very young blast furnace capacity. So it stands to reason that they would like to keep using that. That stands in the way of transitioning to green steelmaking, really. That's a concern. If we compare that, however, to the other partners in the APAC, so on the bottom there, Japan and Korea, those countries have very old blast furnaces. They either need to reinvest or really develop new steelmaking capacity because those plants are so old. And so they're really at that sort of step where they're starting to need to think about, do we make that investment in conventional fossil fuel-based steelmaking again, or are we ready to switch to something else? For India is a different story yet again. They have very little steelmaking capacity as of yet. What they are building right now is still fossil-based, but they are basically at a point in time where they're still not locked in just yet. They might lock them in themselves in if they really build all that blast furnace capacity. That's two things that I've talked about. So that's the blast furnace production route. That is sort of the traditional coal-based steelmaking route, which is 90% of our steelmaking so far. Very suited to our low-quality iron ores from Australia. At the bottom is the direct reduced iron and then electric arc furnace route, which is used in steel from recycled steel scrap, and is also the way to make green steel with very high quality iron ores, not very well suited to the use of Australian iron ores. Fortunately, there is a third way, again with direct reduced iron production. This is where you use your hydrogen. And then the electric smelter furnace. Basically what that smelter furnace does is, you melt all your iron ore, which means that the iron gets separated from the impurities, and you can just scrape the impurities off the top. And then you introduce it into a basic oxygen furnace. Green steel, and it's a production route that is suited to our low quality Australian iron ores. But then the question is, who's going to invest in that green steelmaking capacity? So basically the choice then becomes electric arc furnace or electric smelting furnace route. And the smelting furnace route really is sort of suited to Australian ores, not so much suited to the other ones. And so you can ask the question, why would China, Japan invest in that capacity if that would lock them into using Australian ores, when they can also make the choice to go the other route and use Brazilian or African ores? So really, in a nutshell, what are the key issues here? And my eyes are not good enough to read my own notes over there. But yeah, so the willingness to offshore some steps. Important is that these are subject to considerations of sort of securitization and importance in the domestic economy. If we build an iron ore industry here or iron making or steel making industry here in Australia, do we allow investment from foreign partners, and especially Chinese state-owned investors? That's a scary thing, maybe. And of course, coordination with those partners. So when do we do this? When do we transition? At what pace? What scale? And if we decide to go the route of electric smelter furnace, who will build them? Will we build them in Australia or in our partners? Some key considerations in that process, and I will leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Jorrit. So we've heard from Elizabeth on kind of the big picture of how we start to language this green energy statecraft. We've heard from Baethan around some of those challenges around infrastructure and carbon pricing and what those solutions might be. We've heard from Jorrit on where some of our trading partners are, old versus new blast furnace, who's going to invest, how do they invest? And so now, Warren, let's hear from you on some of the technical aspects of the challenges that we might be able to overcome as well. If you come up to the podium, that'd be great.
Thanks very much, Monica, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to be here. And it was very interesting listening to the preceding speakers, and there's a couple of themes that I was picking up there, which I'll try to bring together in three key points that I guess I want to make in my comments today. First of all, being that Australia has a great opportunity to contribute to emissions reduction in the iron and steel industry. So our exports of iron ore amount to around 1.5 gigatons of emissions, of downstream emissions from that iron and steel sector. So that's around 3 times or over 3 times our national emissions from the entire economy. So we have a significant opportunity to reduce emissions on a global scale, working with our iron and steel partners around the world. But The iron and steel is produced by a vast existing infrastructure of blast furnaces, as Jorrit has very eloquently pointed out. So we can get dramatic emissions reduction by developing new technologies such as hydrogen-based steel making or electrolysis. And we can get a relatively more modest emissions reduction by working with the existing infrastructure by reducing emissions from the blast furnace. But that relatively more modest individual emissions reduction, when you multiply over the existing vast infrastructure, is a much bigger climate impact from making interventions in the iron and steel sector. The other theme that I'd like to really highlight in my talk is the need for coordinated action. So I heard that, I think, Liz, with the green economy statecraft, and also Baethan, you mentioned some of those policies that are required for coordinated action with our trading partners. That's a critical element for that transition. And then thirdly, another major point to make is the scale, but more importantly, the pace of the transition that we're talking about. And there is no white space for us to move into. We're already pushed our planetary boundaries to a point where any change that we make in the system at one point creates perturbations in the system at another point. So we need to be we need to have a much greater awareness of the trade-offs within that integrated system and the impacts that we have by making those kinds of interventions. Because it's the backlash from communities that feel like they're being left out, whether you're a steel maker or iron maker in our offshore steelmaking partners, or if you're part of an impacted community domestically in Australia, that really matter. So we really need to get that participatory co-design, and we need to be well aware of the trade-offs and the impacts that we're having more broadly in the system. So those are my 3 key points. And then I'll run through very quickly a few slides to talk about our observations and our perspective on the iron and steel decarbonisation challenge. So first of all, and this has been touched on earlier as well, we need a much greater share of electric steel making, which goes hand in hand with gas-based reduction and hydrogen reduction in the global steelmaking industry. So currently we have the steelmaking industry is dominated by blast furnaces. We have a relatively smaller amount of electric steelmaking and gas-based DRI, or direct reduced iron production. In a standard decarbonisation scenario, this is from Wood Mackenzie, the share of electric steelmaking is expected to grow, and the share of blast furnace steelmaking is expected to reduce. But you can see on the dotted lines here, in order for us to meet that 1.5 or even 2 degree stated target, we need to probably double that rate of addition of electric steelmaking and reduction of blast furnace steelmaking in order to be able to meet those goals. That is a massive change for a global industry. What does it mean for Australia? Australia exports, as Jorrit has said, predominantly Pilbara-based ore, so that's hematite, goethite ore, which includes a large proportion of very intricately bound gangue materials, so impurities in our ore. It's not easily upgradable. And so a global shift to green steel will put downward pressure on the value of that ore because it doesn't go into a electric steel making process. And it will create a green premium or a benefit for pelletized or upgraded ores. So Australia stands to lose out with a global shift to green steel as it stands currently, if we don't have processes to enable our Pilbara ore to supply a green steel making process. Just want to introduce this kind of chart or illustration for everyone's benefit. This is the iron and steel making value chain, as Jorrit has explained, and you can see that the major components, emissions intensive components of that value chain are sintering and iron ore reduction, which today is largely done offshore from Australia. So our Scope 1 emissions are relatively low compared to the downstream emissions incurred by sintering and iron ore reduction offshore. There's a couple of different scenarios for us to work closely with our steel-making partners though. And so the existing scenario is on the left there. So we export, basically dig and ship and export crude iron ore for reduction offshore. We could, however, do work to our ores to upgrade them and get them into a ready state for more efficient steel making. Simply making that blast furnace more efficient will reduce emissions by up to 20% from blast furnace steel making as it stands. That's a major impact that we can have working with our existing infrastructure. And then secondly, we can also take over more of that iron ore reduction and steel making value chain. So we can do onshore reduction of iron ore using green electrons and green hydrogen, and export a value-added iron product for steel making offshore. And that can result in up to 70 or 80% emissions reduction. In order to do that, I just wanted to illustrate that there's a number of different technology pathways that we can follow. Traditionally, we use a blast furnace combined with a basic oxygen furnace for steel making. We can move to gas-based iron making combined with electric arc furnace, and as Jorrit has said, gas-based iron making with electric smelting furnace, which can use a lower grade Pilbara-based ore. And there's a number of others, including smelting reduction and emerging technologies such as electrolysis. So we have a number of different technology options in order to meet that challenge. But picking up on Baethan's point earlier, why aren't we doing this today? The truth is we have tried in one form or another to do onshore value adding to our iron ore. These are two notable examples. So the BHP HBI project on the top and the Rio Tinto-led High Smelt project on the bottom. These are both efforts to move up this smile curve. So we currently make a lot of money out of digging up iron ore and shipping it off at low cost. What we're talking about is moving up that value chain to try to capture more value by adding value to our iron ore. And that hasn't worked. Both of these projects failed in the case of HBI tragically, and in the case of High Smelt, although it worked, it was deconstructed and sent to China and then I think is still operating there. And the reasons for that are the high capital costs of operating in Australia, the high cost of energy, the high cost of labour in operating in remote areas such as the Pilbara. And those have killed projects previously. So why is the situation any different now? The difference now, our hypothesis is that we can capture a green premium as the world shifts to things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which provides for additional value for green products. So if we export a green iron product, we can capture more of that value. Also, technology costs are coming down, so we can reduce the cost of accessing that opportunity. And that difference has shifted that smile curve up and has created more space for Australia to be able to capture this green steel opportunity. That's the hypothesis that we're working on. And we can see that in action today with developments such as the Project NeoSmelt between BlueScope, Rio Tinto and BHP working together to try to demonstrate the electric smelting furnace pathway. We can see interest from Korea's POSCO in developing onshore iron ore reduction, iron making projects in Australia. And then recently Rio Tinto's bio-iron project, which is seeking to set up a pilot plant in Australia for iron making. And there's a number of other projects at earlier stages that are in development across the Australian ecosystem. So the key point here that I've kind of run through very quickly is the need for coordinated action in order to be able to work together with our partners to capture this opportunity, and the real need to understand the whole of system impacts of any one of these technology options as we consider them and make these investments. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Warren. So we now on our sort of final panellist, we've got Emma here to really speak to one of the next challenges that we haven't really touched at all in this conference, but maybe just a little bit around how do we define green? What's the embedded emissions? How do we actually account for this? And how do we do this in a way that is going to be, fungible with our trading partners? So I'd be really interested to hear some of your thoughts on the work that you've been doing. Thanks, Emma.
Thanks so much, Monica. And Hi, everyone. Oh, yeah, I do project pretty well on my own, but thank you. So I think all of my fellow panelists have talked to the importance of collaboration with our trading partners to make this green export transition. And indeed, you know, Liz has talked about the terminology around green statecraft. I must admit I'm an economist, so I'll keep using green industrial policy for a while, but that's all right. I'll be careful who I say it to. And in fact, one of my research areas has been looking at a particular tool of this green statecraft, which I call international green economy collaborations. And we define these collaborations as sort of government-to-government collaborations aimed at achieving mutual benefits through supporting structural change in both domestic economies and shared value chains. And if you know about definitions of green industrial policy, that sounds very similar. And indeed, one of the ways you could, if you like that terminology, think of these things is as a tool for international green industrial policy. Australia has actually been quite keen under both the previous and current government on establishing these collaborations for all the reasons we've just heard about on this panel. So we have what I would call IGEX with Germany, India, Japan, Korea, Netherlands, Singapore, the UK, and the US. And these things range from sort of a few page MOUs with a whole lot of motherhood statements about how good collaboration is and how great green technology is, to actually sort of more detailed and specific things like the Singapore-Australia Green Economy Agreement, which is actually an agreement. So I don't know if there's anyone sort of familiar with trade agreements in the room, but you might think, is this just environment chapters in a deep trade agreement? Is this another word for that? And the answer is no, because there are no enforcement mechanisms in any of these green economy collaborations, because they're all about the win-wins. They're all about the mutual gains for the partners and for both industry and environment. And so that means you don't need enforcement mechanisms. So they're not the same as deep trade agreements, which were usually about committing to stop doing something that somebody liked doing. So these are a different creature that we're starting to see emerging in international governance. There are quite a few benefits to this approach as opposed to, let's say, environment chapters in deep trade agreements. Obviously, politically, not having to commit to tie anyone's hands and stop them doing things is really good. The fact that they're a little bit fuzzy and we haven't really, they're not instruments of international law as such, means that there can actually be an opportunity, and also their win-win focus, to work even in challenging geopolitical situations. And in fact, the Australia-China Business Council is really pushing the idea of Australia and China establishing one of these agreements for all the reasons that my fellow panelists have shown today. So what is actually in these things? There's a range of different sort of components, and not all these components are in each collaboration, but you do tend to see information sharing, which is sort of 101 for most international agreements, but certainly technology collaboration agreements present in almost all of these collaborations. You also very often see technology collaboration commitments. You see regulatory collaboration. You see education. You sometimes see financing. And in fact, Australia is the only high-income country that has financing commitments in its IGEX with other high-income countries. So most of the times when financing turns up in one of these collaborations is usually about putting some governance around commitments that have been made under climate agreements for financing in lower income countries. And most recently, we're also seeing, as we move from this sort of innovation to scale up in our green transition, we're seeing market coordination commitments. So for example, the Australia-US, I've forgotten the full name of it, Accord on something or other, it includes, commitments to collaborate on projects and standards for clean energy supply chains. And indeed, my pet topic, as Monica alluded, also includes action to promote robust emissions accounting methodologies for key sectors and products like hydrogen and its derivatives, green metals, steel and aluminium. And I think this regulatory collaboration is probably one of the most important aspects of these IGEX, because as we transition to try and make the international trade and investment regimes climate compatible, it's going to get pretty technical. To implement a carbon border adjustment mechanism, you need to have approaches to accounting for the embedded emissions in those products. Now, as an economist, I can tell you that a carbon border adjustment mechanism, if well designed, is a first best unilateral approach in the absence of a global carbon price. However, if we all go and cook up our own methodologies for how to account for those embedded emissions, what you're going to generate is a whole mass of what we call non-tariff barriers to trade. If you think of an Australia exporter who actually has a clean product, but their 5 different export markets all have 5 different accounting methodologies for them to prove that they're green products, that's a huge extra regulatory burden, a cost to trade, an impediment to our green export ambition. And so importantly, the Australian government has really understood this, and not only are they developing the Guarantee of Origin scheme, but they really are working proactively on collaborating to align embedded emissions accounting frameworks so that Australian companies, don't face this excess regulatory burden. And in fact, under the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework for Prosperity, there is what's called colloquially a green economy pillar. And Australia is leading a cooperative working party on embedded emissions accounting alignment through that. So I think that's just one sort of really concrete way or example of how these collaborations can really support our collaboration with our trading partners and roll up our sleeves and deal with some of the technical details, not necessarily only technological, but also regulatory technical details that we actually do need to figure out